Greetings, and welcome to the High Flying Tutors Academy channel. Today, I'll be helping you with a question on general journal for companies, where we are going to learn how to record transactions on application of shares, transactions on allocation of shares, transaction on refund of shares, transaction on declaration and payment of dividends, right? So we are given a question here, Monster Limited Company. So I want us to just go through the question without any waste of time, and we are going to record this question in the general journal. Here is the answer sheet, and we also have got some worksheet where we're going to do some calculations there, right? So without any waste of time, I want us to go and do this question, right? So they say on the 1st of March 2012, Monster Limited was registered with an authorized share capital of 500,000 ordinary shares and 100,000 8% preference shares, right? On the same day, the company offered 20,000 ordinary shares at a value of 60,000 and 10,000 8% preference shares at a value of 50,000 to the incorporators of the company, all right? So remember, when we speak of authorized shares, we're speaking about the stock of shares that is available to be issued. It is there in stock. Then whenever the company want to issue, they're going to fetch from the stock, which is the authorized shares, right? So let's proceed. They say all the shares offered were taken up, paid, allotted, and recorded on the 2nd of March 2012. So this transaction, it has been recorded already. So we're not going to record these ones. All right. But we're going to consider them somehow where necessary. And then they said the following transactions occurred in connection with the further issue of shares to the public during March 2013. And then they say on the first, transaction number 1, they say March 3rd, the company offered 250,000 ordinary shares at a value of 750,000 rand and 50,000 8% preference shares at a value of 250,000 rand to the public. Remember, in this transaction, this is what we are going to allocate. This is what we are going to allocate to the public, right? But we cannot allocate if there was no an application. We just made this available to be issued, but before we issue or before we allocate, there must be an application. So we have to record the application first before we issue. So transaction number 2 says on the March 31st, applications were received for 260,000 ordinary shares and 70,000 preference shares. The full offering of the ordinary and preference shares was allotted and unsuccessful application monies repaid. So we repaid, or we paid people who are unsuccessful, or what we cannot offer, we refund, right? So we are going to record this question. And then they say on the June 30, the company declared a 20-cent ordinary dividends after paying the preference dividends, right? And then record all the transactions regarding share issues and dividends in the general journal for 2013. Show the general narrations. Dividend withholding tax is 20%, all right? When we calculate our dividends right there. So I want us to go and record transaction number 1, but we cannot start with transaction number 1 because remember, transaction number 1 was just an offering of shares. These are shares that are made to be available for issue at these prices, right? So we need to record the application of shares. We need to record the application of shares, and then we're going to allocate what is being offered by the company, and then we refund what we cannot allocate. All right. So, but before we start, I want us to go and calculate price per share for all the shares. All right. We've got preference shares, we've got ordinary shares. So I want us to go to our worksheet right there. I want us to calculate price per share. I'm gonna say calculations calculations price per share. Price per share, right? Because if you check, right, on this question, if you check on transaction number 1, they've given us the number of shares that are offered. They also give us the total rent value for those shares. So we need the price per share. So for us to calculate price per share, we are going to have this formula. We're going to say total rent value divided by number of shares offered. Right, that will be the formula that we'll be using to calculate that will be the formula to calculate now. So let's go and calculate now. So the rent value there the rent value right there, we divide by the number of shares issued. So I want us to go and start with the price per share for ordinary shares. Right, price per share for ordinary shares. We are going to check how much is the rent value for that in our question. So in our question, we have got 250 ordinary shares at a value of 750,000. So it means we have to say 750,000 divided by the 250,000, which is the number of shares offered. That's how we're going to calculate this one. So it's going to be 750,000 divided by 250,000. And then how much is the price per share for ordinary shares? Let's do that calculation quickly. Let's do that calculation quickly. It's going to be 750,000. We divide by 250,000. I'm getting price per share of 3 rand. Price per share of 3 rand, okay? And then number 2, we are going to calculate price per share for preference shares. Preference shares. So preference shares, we're going to check there on our question again. Transaction number 1. They say they've issued, they've offered 550,000 number of shares at a value of 250,000. So for us to calculate the price per share there, we have to go to our worksheet and say 250,000 divided by 50. Remember, 250 is the rent value, and then 50,000 is the number of shares. So let's see how much is the price per share for these ones. Divide by 50,000. So I'm getting a price of 5 rand per share. 5 rand per share, right? So we've got the price per shares for each share right there. All right, and then now we've got the price per share for each, because if you check, the reason why I'm calculating the price per share is because if you check on the application, they only gave us number of shares to be that are applied for, right? But they didn't give us how much is price per share. So the price per share, we got it on this information here, right? And we have calculated price per share for each type of share, which is ordinary and preference. And then according to our calculation, we've got 3 rand ordinary price per share and preference, we've got 5 rand. Now we go and record what? The application of shares, because we need to start with the application always all the time. And then let's go and record this transaction number 2, which is the application of shares first, because we need to start with it. So when we record the application of shares, we're going to start with the date. What is the date there? The date is on the March 31st. So we go to our answer sheet. We're going to say March 31st. And then now recording of the application of shares, we're going to debit bank, because remember, when these people apply for these shares, they also apply with the application form or letter and the money. They also send the money. So you debit bank because you are receiving money for the application, and then you're going to credit application. You're going to credit application and allotment. Application and allotment for ordinary shares. For ordinary shares. All right. And then for ordinary shares, and then you're also going to credit application and allotment preference shares. All right. And then now, after that, you're going to do the calculation. You can do the calculation. We're going to do the calculation. All right. So the calculation is there. We're going to say the number of shares applied for. The number of shares applied for is 260,000 for ordinary shares, right? 260 multiplied by the price per share. Price per share, we calculate it on the other side. So it's just going to be 260,000 number of shares multiplied by price per share. Our price per share, according to our calculations that we've made this side, is 3 rand. So we're going to multiply by 3 rand. So multiply by 3 rand there. Multiply by 3 rand. And then we're going to get an amount to record there. So how much is your application and allotment for ordinary shares? So 260,000 times 3. I'm getting 780,000. All right. And then we're also going to do calculations on application and allotment for preference shares. Open brackets. On preference shares, they applied for how many number of shares? They applied for 70, right? They applied for 70. So we go to our answer sheet. We say 70,000. We multiply by price per share for preference shares. Price per share for preference shares, we calculated right there, it's 5 rand, okay? And then we go to our answer sheet there, we say multiply by 5 rand. Let's see how much is our application and allotment for preference shares. So it's going to be 70,000 multiplied by 5. And then I'm getting 350,000 rand. Okay. And then our bank is going to be the total of this. Our bank is going to be the total there. So our bank is going to be 780,000 plus 350,000. So we received a bank of 1,130,000. 1,130,000. That is how we do this one. And then they said, you remember on the question, they said you must narrate on the journal. You must narrate. They say show the journal narration. So let's go and show narration. So when we narrate, it's just a short summary of what happened. So we received application for shares. So we can say application can say application of shares and monies received. Application of shares and monies received. And then that is the narration. All right. So that was the application. So now remember, after recording the application, we are done. We are going to record the allocation of shares. So when we allocate shares, we are going to allocate shares. The second step, we allocate shares. We are going to debit application. We are going to debit application and allotment. Application and allotment for ordinary shares. Application and allotment for ordinary shares. And then application and allotment preference shares. All right. And then remember, we are allocating capital, right? So when we allocate these shares now, they become capital. So when we allocate, we are going to credit ordinary share capital. All right. And also for preference, we credit preference share capital. So please don't forget that this capital is very important to indicate that you are allocating the dividends to shareholders. Now there is ownership, right? So don't forget that. So now when we record the allocation, we are allocating what? We are allocating the offered shares. So they said they've offered 250 at 750 and 250 for preference, 250,000 rand for preference, which is 50,000 number of shares. So we are going to record the allocation. So when we allocate, we are allocating the ones that we are offered. Total amount that is given already. We don't have to calculate that. So we can just go straight and say we're going to record 750,000 for ordinary, and then 250,000 for preference, and then credit 750,000 for ordinary share capital, and then 250,000 rent for preference share capital. Then we are done with the allocation. And then when you narrate, because they said you must narrate, you're going to say allocation of shares to shareholders. Allocation of shares to shareholders. Then you are done with the allocation of shares. And then let's go and record the last one. The last one is going to be the refund, because if you check, they applied more than what we are offering, then the difference must be refunded, right? So when we refund, we're gonna debit application and allotment application and allotment for ordinary shares, right? And we are also going to refund for application and allotment preference shares. And then because you are making a refund, you are making a payment, you are paying refund, so you you credit bank, because there's a decrease in bank, you credit bank right there. All right, so now remember, they applied for ordinary shares, they applied for shares worth 780,000 rand, but you are only allocating 750. So the difference between the two numbers you refund. So you're going to go into your brackets there and say 780,000 less 750,000. So how much are you refunding for ordinary right there? For ordinary, you are refunding 780,000 less 750,000, which is 30,000. 30,000. 30,000. All right. And then for preference also, open brackets, they applied for shares worth 350,000, but you are only offering 250,000. So what they applied for, 350,000, you less what you are offering. The difference is a refund. All right. So it's gonna be 350,000, you less 250,000 rent, and then you are refunding 100,000. You are refunding 100,000, and then in total you are refunding 100,000 plus 30,000 is going to be 130. So the bank, the amount that is going to be out of your bank for refund is 130,000, and then you are done recording the refund there. Right? You are done with the refund there. And then after that, you have to narrate. Narration will be paid refund to unsuccessful applicants. Unsuccessful applicants. All right, so pay the refund to unsuccessful applicants, then you are done. Right, you are done with the steps. So remember, you always have to start with the application, you allocate, then you refund. Okay, then we are done with transaction number 1 and 2. We are done with transaction number 1 and 2. Now let's go to transaction number 3. Transaction number 3, they say to you, June 30, the company declared a 20-cent ordinary dividends after paying the preference dividends. So remember, on this one, that means dividends. Remember, you cannot pay dividends without declaring, right? Because if you check, preference dividends was declared and paid. Even though they say to us they only paid, they cannot pay without declaring. So on preference dividends, we're going to record first the declaration of dividends, and then we pay. Then after we will declare, we will record the declaration of ordinary dividends, because they didn't mention that it was paid. They just said it was declared after paying preference dividends, right? So number 1, we are going to record the declaration of preference dividends and payment for it. After that, we are going to record ordinary dividends declaration. We are done, right? So let's go and record the declaration of dividends for preference 30 June or June 30, just to keep consistency. June 30. June 30 right there. And then remember, when you declare dividends, you're gonna debit preference dividends, preference dividend, and then you credit shareholders for dividends. Shareholders for dividends. And then you also, because there is withholding tax, so you're gonna credit as well SARS, withholding tax. SARS withholding tax. That's how you record the declaration on dividends, right? So remember, let's go to our worksheet. I want to demonstrate something or highlight something. Remember, I'm gonna say NB. Please note that preference dividends is declared and paid based on the total rent value of shares issued. So that means before we pay dividends, we have a responsibility to calculate the total rent value for shares issued, right? So now I want us to go and calculate the total rent value for shares issued on preference, right? Total rent value. Total rent value preference, total rent value preference shares issued. All right. So now, we're just going to add shares issued from the beginning, which is shares issued from the beginning. Shares issued from the beginning for preference was 10,000 8% preference shares at a value of 50,000 rand. So we have to say 50,000 rand. 50,000 rand plus the allocation of shares for the current year. The allocation for the current year is 250. You see, 250,000 rand. These are monies. So rent value of 250,000. So the total rent value for preference shares issued is 50,000 rand plus 250,000 rand, which gives us 300,000. 300,000, right? 300,000. After calculating the total rent value for preference shares issued, we can calculate dividends on preference shares. Dividends. So to calculate dividends, we are going to say preference share dividends. Preference dividends is going to be calculated based on the rent value of 300,000 multiplied by the percentage behind the preference shares. The percentage behind the preference shares is 8%. So we're going to multiply by 8%. 8%, you're gonna get 24,000. That is your preference dividends. That is your preference dividends. All right. And then now this preference dividends, we can come and record this side, right? 24,000 rent. Okay. Therefore, we need to calculate SARS withholding tax. Our SARS withholding tax, remember, is 20%. So in brackets there, we're going to say 24,000 rent multiplied by 20% for withholding tax. That means our shareholders for dividends is 8%. It's 80%, not 8%, but 80%. So it's going to be 24,000 multiplied by 24,000 multiplied by 80 out of 100. All right. So how much is our shareholders for dividends right there? Quickly, let's do that calculation. It's going to be 24,000 multiplied by 24,000 multiplied by 80 divided by 100. I'm getting 19,200. 19,200. All right. And then 20% for SARS withholding tax is going to be 24,000 multiplied by 20 divided by 100. 24,000 multiplied by 20 divided by 100. I'm getting 4,800. All right. And then we are done with the recordings. Now we can narrate. When you narrate, you're going to say preference dividends declared. Preference dividends declared. Preference dividends declared. All right. Preference dividends declared. Okay. And then remember, we started by the declaration because they said they've paid the preference. So now we're going to record the payment. The second step is that we must record the payment. All right. So the payment, when you pay dividends, you debit shareholders. For dividends. And then debit again SARS, because you're also making payment for that SARS withholding tax. SARS withholding tax. SARS withholding tax. And then because you're making a payment, you're going to obviously credit the bank. Right? And then amount there is going to be 19,200. You're just copying from there, from the declaration. And then SARS 4,800. And then you're going to make a payment of 24,000. Right? And then narration. After recording, narrate. Narration, you're going to say paid dividends, paid preference dividends to shareholders. Right? Then you are done. Paid preference dividends to shareholders. Then you are done. All right. And then now because remember, ordinary dividends, it was declared after paying the preference dividends. So now we need to go and record the declaration of ordinary dividends. Right? So I'm gonna go back to our answer, our worksheet. Let's work on the worksheet. NB again. Note that ordinary dividends is declared and paid according to total number of shares, not rent value, but number of shares issued. Ordinary dividends is declared and paid according to total number of shares issued. So now it means, number one, we've got the responsibility to calculate total number of shares issued for ordinary. Total ordinary shares issued. All right, so we've got that responsibility. All right, so let's go back to our question. On our question, we're going to say, we're going to take the opening shares issued or offered plus allocated number of shares during the year, which is 250. So total number of shares issued is going to be 20,000 number of shares issued at the beginning plus 250 number of shares issued during the year, which is going to be 250,000 plus 20,000, which is going to be 270,000 number of shares or shares. All right. After that, we can calculate the dividends based on the 20 cent given on the price per share on dividends. All right. So it's going to be, we're calculating now ordinary dividends. Ordinary dividends. All right, so ordinary dividend is going to be total number of shares multiplied by the price per share on dividends, which is 0.20, which is 20 cents. That is 20 cents. Just put R there. Just that's 20 cents. Then how much is our dividends right there? Let's see. 270,000 multiplied by 20 cents. I'm getting 54,000 rent dividends. 54,000 rent. So we can go and record. So when we record, remember format says we're gonna say ordinary dividends. Debit ordinary dividends, credit shareholders for dividends. And then we're also gonna credit SARS withholding tax. SARS withholding tax. All right. And then this 54 is going to be our ordinary dividends, okay? Which is going to come here. Ordinary dividends, which is going to be 54,000. All right. And then we're going to calculate 80% for shareholders for dividends, which is going to be 54,000 multiplied by 80 out of 100. All right. And then how much are you getting right there? 54,000 times 80. I'm getting 43,200. And then withholding tax is 20%. So it's going to be 54,000 multiplied by 20%, 20 out of 100. Okay. And then how much there? Let's see. 54,000 multiplied by 20%. I'm getting 10,800. And then I am done with the recording of the declaration of ordinary dividends. And then payment, you record the same, and then you're gonna narrate paid paid ordinary dividends to shareholders. But now we are not required to do that in this question, but at least there are videos where I demonstrate how to record this. So let's proceed. Now we have to narrate. We're gonna say ordinary dividends declared. Simple as that. Ordinary dividends declared. And then we are done with our question. If there is any question or you need clarity, you can put on the comment, right? And I will attend to you. And also remember that we offer private sessions, whether online or face-to-face. You can put a comment, I'll attend to it. And please note that below, if you check on the icons below, there's an icon for Thanksgiving. I think it starts from 14 Rand. Please, if you have got something like 14 Rand or so, don't mind to just donate there. All right, and Thanksgiving. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Salute.